All right, so we've got our Facebook audiences here, our Zoom audience is tuning in. So welcome everybody to Understanding Feed Types and Diets. Tonight's webinar is generously sponsored by Alltech and Macaulay's. And tonight we are featuring Josie Solomon, who is a nutritional consultant with Macaulay's and Alltech, and she serves the Kentucky, Tennessee, and Florida areas. So I'll turn it over to Josie here in a moment. But first, just a little bit of housekeeping. If you folks have questions as we go through the material, don't be afraid to jot those down in the comments on Facebook or in the Q&A or the chat on Zoom. And we will get to all the questions in the end. That way Josie can get through all of her content first, and then we'll address the questions as they come in. But definitely feel free to jot it down so you don't forget by the time we get to the Q&A at the end. So this webinar was made possible by the generous support of Macaulay's and Alltech, and we're very grateful for that. If you would like to make a contribution to the RRP today only, we have a match grant going on for our Fund a Need program. You can find that link on our Facebook page. It's therrp.org/fund-a-need. And any contribution you make today will be doubled up to $1,000 total, thanks to our board member, Sissy Wicks. So if you have a chance and you appreciate the content tonight and you'd like to give a little bit back to the RRP, we definitely welcome donations for our Fund a Need. So with that out of the way, Josie, I'm going to let you take it away.
Thanks. Hi, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us. I'm excited to get a chance to talk a little bit about this topic. I know it tends to get a little confusing because there's so many options, which is a great thing, but also can cause some confusion as well. So some of the topics we're going to talk about today. So first and foremost, we're going to do a really brief who is Macaulay's, and so that way you understand who we are and what we provide to the equine industry. And then we're also going to talk about feed types and feed forms. What are the benefits? What are the cons? And so that might help you choose. And then we're also going to talk about some cereal grains that you commonly find in horse feeds, and how do those compare to each other in digestibility and availability to our horses. And then lastly, we're going to briefly talk a little bit about some of the Macaulay feeds and supplements, because obviously that's how we bring the nutrition aspects to our horses. So first and foremost, Macaulay Feeds was established in 1938, and our headquarters is in Versailles, Kentucky. Our Versailles, Kentucky feed mill is an equine-only feed mill, which is pretty rare in today's day and age. And the thing that really separates Macaulay's is its extremely high ingredient standards. With that, it's free of drugs and animal byproducts in our feed mill in Versailles, Kentucky. And we also are very stringent on our safety standards and also quality of ingredients. So just to give you an example, for any of our corn products that come in, we actually require a test to be sent to us before it even is sent. And then we also test it again before it even leaves the truck, just to make sure that there's absolutely no testable levels of mycotoxins. And then another high standard that Macaulay's has is with an example, our oats. So we import heavyweight Canadian oats. And just to give you some insight, those are better quality than USDA grade 1. So we're going to talk a little bit about oats later in the talk, but I just wanted to kind of briefly give some examples of what really separates Macaulay's in the means of a quality and what we think should be in these horse formulas. Another shout out I want to give is some of our influential team members. So obviously we have a team of representatives and consultants just like myself across the US, but also at our headquarters in Versailles, we also have Dr. John Liu, who is he's our PhD, but also a horseman himself. So he really understands, what these horses need and how we could bring cutting edge new research into these formulas. And then another member I want to give a shout out to is Amy Parker. She is another nutritionist that definitely provides a lot of consultation work. And we have an amazing team at Macaulay's, but just to give a brief shout out. Another thing I wanted to mention is Alltech. Alltech is our parent company, and they own the brand Macaulay's. Alltech is a family-owned company, and they were founded in 1980, but they are a global company. Our headquarters is in Nicholasville, Kentucky, and they have a significant focus on research and innovation, and they're big thing that they provide to the table is nutritional technologies. So we have our own research farm in Nicholasville, Kentucky, which is right outside of Lexington, and so that way we can make sure that we are providing the best nutritional technologies and make sure the proof's in the pudding. Make sure that we're getting the best out of our animals. So I'm very excited about what Alltech and Macaulay's brings to the table, and it helps definitely at a field level and helping these horses be their best. So talking about the equine feed market, like we mentioned before, there's a lot. There's a lot of options, and it could get very confusing just because of everything that you can find on the World Wide Web. But it's very different than other livestock industries. So if I think about the poultry industry or the swine industry or the beef industry, they tend to have common goals, whether that's egg production, maybe that's feeding rates or growth rates. And so because of these common goals, they can get a lot of research looking at how they could precisely use nutrients to achieve those goals. However, in the horse industry, we many times have different goals. We might have goals of breeding for breeding operations, or maybe performance due to training facilities, or we might even just have recreational goals. And then on top of that, you throw in, throw in life stage, or maybe your horse has a special need. Maybe they're insulin resistant or laminitic, or maybe have tie-up issues like PSSM. And then on top of that, we ask our horses to have a particular appearance. So we want a particular level of body conditioning, muscle, and then also maybe hair and coat. So that definitely adds a layer to how our goals get a little convoluted. And then on top of that, you typically throw on industry trends or even some human nutrition fads that people try to associate with horses. And all it does is lead to the endless options of horse products that we have, and once again, creates confusion. But something that I like to think about is, what is the entire purpose of feed? The entire purpose of feed is to supplement what's missing out of your forage. And with horses being hindgut fermenters, their forage is meant to be the majority of their diet. So I say minimum of 51%, but I typically like to have a large fraction as forage. So when we're trying to supplement what's missing out of forage, we got to know what is missing out of forage. And so something that I like to advocate for a lot, and you will hear it from me many more times, is going to be to get your forage tested. And you could get this at the local extension agent, or there's other companies that help with this and show you what is missing out of your forage. But in addition to having your forage tested, what might be missing depends on your horse's life stage and or workload. So on the right here, this is a graph that I put together, and it shows the average 1,000-pound horse at a moderate workload eating 20 pounds a day of average Timothy hay. And what you could see here, it is not providing enough calories for that type of workload and that type of horse. It has plenty of protein in this scenario, but it's also deficient in the trace minerals like copper, zinc, selenium, and also vitamin E, which is very common in our forages to be deficient in. So once again, what you need to supplement in addition to forage may depend a lot on your specific scenario and what your specific forage is bringing to the table. So moving on to commercially mixed feeds. We talked about the entire purpose of these feeds, which is to supplement, but these are formulated with a minimum feeding rate. And this is very specific to make sure that we achieve getting those trace mineral requirements and some of those other small nutrients in at the correct feeding rate with average good quality hay. So on the picture on the right is an example of a tag I just ripped off of one of our feeds, and it says that you need to feed 1/2 pound to 2 pounds per 100 pounds of body weight. Excuse me. And with that, so that means for the average 1,000-pound horse with this feed, with average quality hay, you need to feed a minimum of 5 pounds a day. And some horses will be fat with that feeding rates, and some will make sure they'll cover all our needs. But I wanted to show that you need to pay attention and look at your feeds at home and look at your tags and look at your bags to see what is the minimum feeding rate. And then, as you can see, the minimum feeding rate is in a weight. So in our example, we have pounds. Something that I talk a lot with horse owners is making sure that we're feeding by weight and not feeding by volume. So I have a lot of horse owners that when I have conversations and consults with them, they tell me, well, I feed a scoop, well, I feed 2 scoops, or I feed a coffee can, I feed 3 quarts, or whatever that may be. You really need to weigh your feed and your scoop to make sure that you know that what is the weight that you are providing in our feeding rates, and also am I meeting these minimums. With that, I also highly recommend weighing each of your feeds that you might be using, because one feed does not weigh the same as the next. And if you are changing feeds, once again, if it was an example, 3 pounds per quart for this feed, it may weigh differently with the next feed. So highly recommend at least weighing that to get an idea of what you're providing. Like we mentioned before, the entire purpose of this is to ensure we're getting our minimums and our vitamin mineral premix and our feeds, and making sure we're covering all those requirements. Another conversation I typically have with horse owners is that many people like to mix commercial feeds and or cut with cereal grains, and we highly recommend against that. When you do that, you interfere with the nutritional balance. You take that formulation that the PhD put together, crumple it up and toss it out, because once again, when you are mixing that, it doesn't provide what was calculated. And I know a lot of people that typically do this because of the nutritional technologies that might be in different feeds. So if somebody wants to feed a pound of this feed because it has a digestive support, or a pound of this feed because it supports top lines, and a couple pounds of this feed because it calms their horse down. Well, if you're not feeding the feeding rate that was recommended, you're probably not achieving the technology levels that you should get to achieve those goals in the first place. So once again, I highly recommend against mixing feeds. Another thing that we just talked about was cutting it with cereal grains. If in this example, we took this feed, and instead of feeding 5 pounds per day, we fed 2 and fed a couple pounds of oats. Well, we're taking that mineral package and basically cutting it in half. So once again, highly recommend against cutting your feed with cereal grains and or mixing. So the next part of this talk, we're going to talk about what is the difference between feed types or feed forms. So we're going to discuss forage balancers, textured feeds, pelleted feeds, extruded feeds, cubes, and also complete feeds. Because once again, there's a lot on the market. First and foremost, I want to talk about forage balancers. This is one of my favorite tools in my toolbox, and I use this a lot in the field. Forage balancers, for those that are not familiar with them, are a concentrated pellet. So think it's going to be elevated in levels of protein, vitamins, minerals, and maybe a nutritional technology. It's not meant to provide a lot of calories to the diet. Think of a protein shake with a full vitamin mineral pack. It's concentrated, you feed small volumes. So many forage balancers, including ours, is fortified to be fed at only 1 or 2 pounds a day for the average 1,000, 1,200 pound horse. This is typically used for horses that are easy keepers and can live and carry their body conditioning on maybe forage alone. But once again, forage alone doesn't provide all the trace minerals that we need. This is one example of where I'm okay with mixing cereal grains. But once again, we're not cutting the feed. We're not decreasing the volume provided. We are still providing that 1 or 2 pounds a day and implementing maybe a cereal grain. The reason I use this in that scenario is because I've come across some scenarios, some horses that have had maybe some sensitivities and couldn't use some of the commercially mixed feeds. So with this, they might provide calories through a cereal grain, forage pellets, beet pulp, fat, and then just use the forage balancer as the concentrated trace mineral and protein package provided for that diet. The next feed I want to talk about are textured feeds. And just to give you a description of what may be included in textured feeds, there's a wide variety of ingredients that can be, but not always included in textured feeds. You may see loose cereal grains, so you might see your oats or corn. Many times a balancer pellet, so just like what we described, a pellet that's concentrated and has the mineral package and the protein involved. You might also see some fiber ingredients. I've seen some textured feeds that have maybe beet pulp and also some fat ingredients. So some textured feeds have a high level of sprayed on fat and or they might have an extruded fat nugget. So the idea with these textured feeds is that you are getting a blended product that is balanced, but you can see a lot of the ingredients. There's multiple forms that these textured feeds include, and these may be sweet feeds. So this many folks are familiar with the pellet with the loose grains and then some molasses covered on the top. There's also a pelleted blend that might be high in fat. So these formulas tend to be 10% or higher in fat. So that high moisture content also dictates that it would be a textured feed. And then another one would include what we call a dry blend. So this might have the cereal grains in the pellet balancer, but may not have the moisture content. It may not have the high fat or it may not have that molasses covered. So one of the cons and something that I like to talk to horse owners about is these textured feeds tend to have a shorter shelf life. So these feeds, you need to feed quicker, make sure they stay fresh, and they don't last nearly as long as some of the other options. The next feed I want to talk about are pelleted feeds. So the average size is a 5/32 inch in diameter pellet. And the idea of these types of feeds is all of the ingredients are ground into a mash and then shoved through a die to create the pellets. So they may use very similar ingredients to a textured feed or maybe very different ingredients, but all that to say is the whole idea is the ingredients are ground, put into a mash and shoved through the die. And there's a lot of benefits for a pelleted feed. So some of the benefits include, hey, the ingredients are thoroughly mixed and every bite that your horse has is going to be the same. So just to give you some ideas, I have had many picky horses that might pick out the oats and leave the pellets in a textured feed. I've had horses that ate the pellets and left the beet pulp in a textured feed. So the idea of a pelleted feed, once again, is every bite has the same mineral package and ingredients that are part of that formula. We also see an increase in digestibility with pelleted feeds. And the reason being is because all of those ingredients are ground. And when they are ingested, then the smaller particle size allows easier availability to the digestive enzymes. The digestive enzymes could get to the ingredients a little better and help break that down. So once again, we see an increase in digestibility with these pelleted feeds, and they also have a longer shelf life compared to textured feeds. So depending on your management style at home, this does provide a benefit. The next feed type I want to talk about is going to be extruded feeds. So extruded feeds have, similarly to pellets, they have all of their ingredients ground up into a mash and they're passed through an extruder. So an extruder provides high temperature and high pressure, which bursts the starch. Something that's going to help you with the idea of extruded feeds, think of dog food. That is a form of extruded product. The benefits of extruded feed include this very similar concept to pelleted products. So once again, the ingredients are thoroughly mixed. We do have an increase in digestibility compared to textured feeds. They do have a longer shelf life. That's also a great benefit. And with this extrusion process, they can, I'm not saying all formulas do, but they can have a higher level of fat in the product and it won't fall apart as easily. The downside of extruded feeds is that they tend to be costly and the weight per volume tends to be less. So this is a prime example of where I mentioned to weigh your feed with your scoop. So an example, if you have a 3-quart scoop of pellets versus a 3-quart scoop of extruded feeds, the extruded feed typically will weigh less. So make sure you're providing the correct volume when you are feeding this. Cubed feeds. This is a product that I think is less known, but it definitely is a very beneficial type of product for a lot of scenarios. So our cube feeds, when I'm not referencing like the forage pellets, like the big, sorry, forage cubes. That's not what I'm referencing. When I'm referencing cubed feeds, basically think of a large pellet. They tend to be 8.5 inch in diameter. So think of maybe the end of your finger. And they have the same benefits of pelleted feeds. So the thoroughly mixed ingredients, the increased digestibility, and the longer shelf life compared to textured feeds. They have all the same benefits. And there's also some benefits for outdoor feeding. So with these basically large pellets, you have a decrease in loss. So if your horse kicks over the pan or they are munching along and drop some, they could pick that up and you have less loss in outdoor feeding. Another thing is that your horse, when they are eating these off the ground or consuming these off the ground, they also consume less dirt or sand. So I have a lot of benefits with these, especially in Florida, when there's a lot of sand colic and sand consumption. Horses could pick these up without consuming a lot of, once again, dirt or sand. And another benefit of cube feeds is that they actually have increased chewing. So with the larger size, they chew more than pelleted products, and that ends up providing more saliva production, and it also helps buffering some of the stomach acid with that saliva production. And the last one I want to talk about is going to be complete feeds. And the reason why I put this on here is because I get a lot of questions about complete feeds. Complete feeds can be in any of the forms I mentioned before. So they could be pelleted, they could be in texture, they could be extruded, they could be cubed. So they could be in any form. But the idea of a complete feed is that your horse may consume this product at 100% without the addition of forage and get everything they need. So the idea of this feed is really meant for maybe seniors that have poor dentation and can't consume long stem hay. But because of this, I want you to make sure you're reading your feed tags, because they tend to have higher minimum feeding rates. The idea is, if you're going to feed, an example, 15 to 20 pounds a day of this, because once again, you're not feeding forage, then they actually decrease the mineral rates many times on this, so that way you don't run into toxicity problems with the higher feeding rate. So once again, if you are wanting to use a product like this, this is the way that those feeds are formulated. The reason I get a lot of questions about complete feeds is because many times people want to come to me and they ask for a feed that will completely check all of their requirements with the addition of forage and good quality forage. And obviously many feeds that are on the market will do that. And it's not the same definition as complete feeds in the feed world. So how do you choose? I have a lot of horse owners that love one or the other, and it really comes down to preference. If you have horses that maybe you're using some top dresses or medications and you need something with a little moisture to add to get those products to stick, maybe you need a textured feed. If you are a horse owner that really doesn't like the flies in the summer and they don't like cleaning a bunch of buckets, then maybe you want a pelleted product. But it really comes down to horse owner preference first and foremost. And then also another thing to take in consideration is if your horse has any special needs. If your horse, once again, has poor dentation, that might lead you to more of a complete product that has something like that. Or maybe they have insulin resistance, laminitic prone, or have tie-up issues like PSSM, then maybe I don't want a textured feed that has a lot of molasses inclusion. So once again, first and foremost, it really comes down to any of your horse's special needs and also your horse owner preference and your management style at home. The next topic we're going to talk about are common cereal grains that we find in these horse feeds. These cereal grains tend to include oats, corn, barley, and wheat. They're rarely found as the sole ration for these horses. And the reason being is because they are low in trace minerals. So once again, if our forage is not providing enough trace minerals, providing an additional sole ration of cereal grains is not going to cover our trace mineral requirements. But they are typically used to help increase calories in our ration. They are a great source of calories, and that's why we bring them into our rations and use them. So in processing cereal grains, many times you'll see these whole, rolled, crimped, ground, pelleted, or extruded. And the research shows that with increased processing comes increased digestibility. So just like we spoke earlier about, the pelleted idea is, once again, if these grains are ground or extruded, pelleted, that does increase the availability of those nutrients to the digestive enzymes in the horse, once again, increasing their digestibility. So the first one I want to talk about are oats. These are the most popular and also the safest cereal grain for horses. The reason being is because they're higher in fiber content compared to the rest of the cereal grains. In addition to that, the oat starch is more digestible than other cereal grains as well. And we kind of spoke a little bit about it earlier, but the heavier the oat, the more calories available. So to give you an idea, USDA 1 grade oats are 34 pounds per bushel. And when we import our Canadian heavyweight oats, they tend to average about 46 pounds per bushel. So that higher weight provides more starch from the oat and more calories available to our horses. But just to give you some numbers down here at the bottom, you will typically see oats processed whole, crimped, rolled, crushed, ground. There are a number of ways, but I also made some notes on the digestibility of these processes in the small intestine of the horse. We want these cereal grains to be digested as much as possible in the small intestine and not push off into the hindgut where the fermentation of our forages is meant to happen. So looking at our whole oats, about 83.5% are digested in the small intestine. But if I grind these oats, 98% are digested. So virtually almost all is digested in the small intestine, which provides a lot of calorie availability and also safety with the cereal grain. The next one is going to be corn. So on paper, it is the most calorie dense grain that we typically provide to horses. There's a lot of calories. However, less of this is going to be available to the horse compared to the oat. And the reason being is because the starch molecules in the corn is more dense and less available to those digestive enzymes that we just talked about earlier. Also, what plays into that is the way the starch is provided. So when we look at the cereal grains, we tend to look at how much amylose and amylopectin is available. And so the corn starch is less available to these digestive enzymes. To give you some numbers, looking at ground oats, we talked about 98% being available and digestible in the small intestine, whereas about 71% of ground corn is available and digestible in the small intestine. So that's the difference. However, it is still a good calorie source to use. And also, I want to caution to make sure that any ingredients are going to be tested for fumonisin. These mycotoxins can be not seen potentially from the naked eye. So we got to make sure you test for that. But the processing that you're probably going to notice is going to be whole versus cracked, steamrolled, and crushed or ground available for the corn in your formulas. The next ingredient I'd like to talk about is barley. So the barley's digestibility is somewhere between oats and corn, a little closer to corn, but between the two. The reason being is because the hull of the barley is pretty tough, and then also its starch molecules are also dense, kind of like corn. But it is a good calorie source, and the processing that you'll typically see with this ingredient are going to be rolled, crimped, or steam flaked. Wheat. This is one I like to talk about because you're not typically going to find wheat straight up in horse formulas. And the reason being is because most of it's going to be used for human food consumption. If you do find wheat in horse rations, it might be more commonly found in the Western US. However, we very commonly see wheat middlings in horse feeds. Wheat middlings are a byproduct of the flour milling production, and the wheat middlings include the wheat bran, shorts, and germ. These typically you see and very commonly used as the base of a lot of horse feeds. And the reason why is because the industry has had a push for lower starch and sugar formulas. So wheat mids do allow a lower starch and sugar content in these rations compared to other cereal grains. But the base of this feed, or the wheat mids, is less digestible than oats. So all this to say, when we're comparing these cereal grains, oats tend to be the golden star that we compare all of these cereal grains to. Wheat mids do provide a pretty pellet. They do hold everything together very well, but at the same time, they are a little less calorie available. So with that, I appreciate you staying in there and listening to the different forms and the different cereal grains that are typically available. Something I briefly want to speak about is some of the Macaulay feed products that we have, because once again, that's how we provide these rations to our horses, our products that are available in the market. Our Macaulay's formulas are oat-based. That's what really separates a lot of it. And we talked about the ingredient quality. And we also have fixed formulas. So I know ingredient cost had dramatically changed over the past couple years, and there was a lot of pressures to try to help alleviate some of the costs. But Macaulay's is, like I said, a fixed formulation, and we don't change that. And I think that's something that horse owners really value, and making sure that that consistency is there. If you get a chance, check out our website and you can check out our products, and then also see if there's any dealers around your area. And you could also request a nutritional consult for your specific horse and situation. So just to kind of briefly go over some of the products we have, because we talked about the different forms that we mentioned before. We have 3 forage balancers, and they provide different levels of protein depending on the type of forage that you are providing to your horse. Then also some added different technologies that are from Alltech. We have a specialty feed called Alum. This product is built for the horses that have insulin resistance or laminitic prone, tie-up concerns, or even post-colic surgery. This is a really great safe feed for all of those scenarios, that is lower in starch and sugar, and also higher in fiber to help with those specialty needs. These are a number of our feeds that are kind of moderate in calories. So once again, you can feed a little more, feed a little less, cover a wide variety of horses. And we talked about the different forms. So we have pellets and cubes and textured options, and a lot of moderate calorie options. And the last one I wanted to, oh, not the last one, but high calorie feeds. I know that with horses that are performing, many times we're trying to get a lot of calories into them. So these are some of our high calorie feeds, and also pelleted versus textured options, and with higher fat and oat inclusions. Lastly, I know we once again try to provide a lot of calories. So these are some of our fat supplements. Depending on if you have a preference for an oil and or a dry fat supplement, we have both available as well. So I really appreciate you sticking in there and hanging out with us. I'm open to questions, and this is my contact info. So if you do want to circle back to me a little later, I'm always welcoming questions or pictures and how do I fix this scenario. You guys are always welcome to call, text, email, but this is my contact if you need it.
All right, folks, feel free to chime in with questions. Turn my camera back on. You can leave your questions in the Q&A on Zoom or right in the comments on Facebook. And I have a couple of my own because I am also a horse owner. So I'm going to jump right in with mine. So Josie, when you mentioned earlier about, not mixing feeds, I did notice that like Macaulay's has a fat supplement plus, all of its other arrays of feeds. And I'm doing that right now. I'm mixing like a ration balancer with a senior feed with a fat supplement, all from the same brand. So
Yep.
is that appropriate, or are you talking like don't mix and match, like, oh, a ration balancer from over here and then a senior from over there and then something else I found on the internet? Like, explain that not mixing feeds a little bit again.
That's a good question. So when I mention not mixing feeds, I don't necessarily consider fat supplements, and I don't consider forage supplements. So that could be forage pellets or anything like that. I don't consider that into the don't mix, right? What I do consider is, hey, if you wanted to mix our alum and our finisher 14, like I don't recommend that because once again, those mineral recommendations might be thrown off. I have used the balancer in a similar manner like you have, for a couple different ways, but once again, just for simplicity, I don't recommend mixing it. So when I gave the example earlier of some of these horses that have some sensitivities to ingredients, and they say, you know what, I'm just going to mix a balancer and some cereal grains and some forage pellets. In my mind, that is okay because we are feeding the recommended feeding rate of the balancer. So once again, for simplicity, I highly recommend not mixing all those things, but that balancer mix is probably the only example that it's easy to say, hey, that does still fit the things we need.
Mhm. Yeah, because typically in the description for ration balancer, it can be used to like say you can only do one feeding a day, or for whatever reason you can't get the horse the minimum amount of another grain. The balancer helps fill in some of the gaps, or at least
Yeah.
in some brands, that's how it's marketed. So okay,
Yes. Yep. And that's how I use it. Yep.
great. Okay, let's see. I'm just going to mention this one. Thank you, Macaulay's, for helping feed the many standardbreds at the Standardbred Retirement Foundation. Not as much a question, just a comment, but I thought I'd share that one.
You're welcome.
All right, this is a big question from Sophie in Zoom. How do you feed an OTTB in transition from the track to a new owner? So that's a major lifestyle shift, from a horse that's been racing and presumably getting like a pretty high test feed, for that lifestyle, and then transitioning to a totally different career.
Yes, that is a big thing. So there's a lot of things that I typically try to pay attention to. And there's not a one size fits all. So even the guidance I'm about to give, you're always welcome to call it with your specific scenarios. But to give you some call outs to pay attention to, like you mentioned, with those racehorses, they tend to feed feeds that are extremely high calorie and extremely high volumes of feed. And they tend to have lesser hay volumes and forage volumes. So when I'm transitioning over, I want to be cognizant of, first and foremost, there might be some gut issues. There might be some ulcerative issues just because of the sheer volume of feed that they're feeding. On top of that, so I want to make sure that I'm paying attention to try and not exacerbate those ulcers. Another thing is I want to try to increase the forage, because we talked about forage is meant to be the vast majority of the horse's diet. But you might see some loose stools with that. One, you're changing the forage. I mean, the hay type there versus the hay type at your farm, obviously you're going to be different. Something that a lot of horse owners don't think about is when I change forage, the bacterial populations in the hindgut have to adjust for that. So when I am changing, like you said, from maybe the track to home and I'm increasing the volume, I probably want to be a little cautious with the rate that I just throw forage at them. If you see your horses start getting a little loose, that could be part of it. So I like to implement calories through fat because fat will help with not exacerbating ulcers. I also like to be cognizant of increasing fiber because that's a change that's going to be in everyday life. And if you need to ask some questions about, hey, the horse's health with any previous issues they might have had when you got them. So you could provide calories without providing a lot of volume that the horse is used to on the track.
Great, Sophie, if that answered your question, then great. And if not, definitely feel free to follow up with another question. Here is an anonymous attendee in Zoom wants to know, what about horses with allergies? Do you have anything without cottonseed and flax?
That is a good question. So with allergies, I've seen a few different things. Obviously, I think allergy panels are becoming more and more popular and that people are asking for these. The thing about flax on these allergy panels is it's actually fairly new. So it's only been brought to the allergy panel, I think, in the past couple years. So I think they're still kind of figuring out the parameters. So in my mind, if your horse has got a low sensitivity to flax, to me, that's a little different. I think they're still figuring out. If it's very high on the sensitivity, then yes, we do have feeds without flax. We do have feeds without cottonseed hulls. That's not a great quality ingredient that horses absorb very well. So we definitely have products that don't have that. Another thing that we talked about earlier, we said, hey, do we need to find a product that doesn't have that and use a ration balancer? So the way that I approach these horses is, one, I'd like to boost the immune system, make sure that we don't have any pathogenic bacterial problems that might be exacerbating the immune system and getting feed ingredients when they're not supposed to be in the digestive system. And then once again, how intense is that sensitivity on the panel? But we do have products that don't have an example ingredients like flax.
That's good to know. I didn't realize that with, a flax allergy panel. So interesting. No problem, Rebecca. We got you anyway. So I am going to throw in another one of my own questions because this is something that I goofed up on when I got my first off-track thoroughbred in 2018. He didn't have a lot of top line, and in my mind, and in the sort of rudimentary research I had done, to help with top line, you should feed more protein. So I looked at the protein breakdown in a ration balancer and thought, oh, this is really high in protein, so I can just feed more of this, right? So he was on 2 feedings a day of 3 pounds of ration balancer. And then later on, I figured out that that's not how that works. But why is that not how that works? Why can't you just feed more ration balancer and give a horse more protein?
So there are a lot of things that go into building top lines. Protein quality is one fraction of it, right? And also exercise is the other part of it. Some horse people think it's just one or the other. In all reality, it's a combination of both. In addition to that, when you talked about adding more protein, well, there is an upper threshold to where the horse is going to absorb it, and there's going to be excess going to be urinated out. So there is an upper threshold. So what I typically pay attention to is protein quality versus a whole bunch of protein quantity. So to give you some examples, this is something that not many people think about because, to be fair, when we look at these feeds, you only get the feed tag, right? That's the only information that you really get. Wheat mid based feeds, wheat mids as a whole average about 14% protein, just to kind of give you a rough idea, okay? And so if I'm trying to make a horse feed that is, let's say, 12 or 14%, and I'm adding all my cereal grains and adding all my things, I have to add less soybean meal to make that to a 14% feed, right? When I have an oat-based product, oats are not high in protein. And so I have to add more soybean meal to make up that difference, to make it a 12 or 14. And the reason why I bring this up is because the amino acid profile of soybean meal is much better than the amino acid profile of wheat mids. So first and foremost, I look at amino acid profiles and I look at the type of protein we're providing. We also have feeds that have whey protein added as well. So once again, looking at protein quality. Just to give you guys an idea, my shoe leather is roughly about 14% protein. But I guarantee if I start chewing on it, I'm probably not going to get a whole lot out of it.
So, and then the ration balancer itself, has on the tag that it should be fed at a rate of usually like about 1 pound a day.
Mm-hmm.
So why is that, like, how does that work that you can feed a pound of that and get the same amount as, like, let's say 4 pounds of a senior feed?
Yes, that's a great question. So basically, when we're looking at these ration balancers, we mentioned before that they're concentrated, right? So our ration balancers, we had a couple up there that were 30%. So if I have 30% of 1 pound or maybe 2 pounds, the amount of protein that's provided is going to be similar to if I had a 14% feed and fed, like you said, 4, 5, or 6 pounds. So it's a weight. We do everything in the nutrition world by weight.
And so that's how the ration balancer is able to work with the other grains. If you're not able to feed that minimum amount, the ration balancer helps to fill in.
Yep, because you're providing a 30% protein at a pound or two.
Right. Okay. I've seen the question come up again since I've made that error. So I'm always like, wait, when I see other people bringing that up. All right. So we've got a couple questions again in Zoom. Do Macaulay feeds contain soy?
We have feeds that contain soy and we have feeds that don't contain soy. So that really depends on one, if your horse does have a sensitivity, or two, maybe you are providing a forage like a legume, like a alfalfa hay that's very high in protein, and you don't need all of that. So we do have feeds that have it, and we have feeds that don't, depending on what your management style needs.
And folks should just look at the tag to determine.
Yep. Yep.
And in a similar vein, I think this is asking if the feeds are GMO free or contain GMO ingredients.
I can't guarantee that they're not GMO free just because of the type of ingredients. So an example, if the product has soy, it's most likely to have something like that in there. I mean, just like that type of strain of soy in there. And then also if there's corn included. So once again, I can't guarantee that that's not the case.
Here's a question from Emily. What is the max I can feed in one serving of a senior feed? Or does this depend on the type of senior feed?
Oh, good question. So I like to give a rule of thumb. I like to give a rule of thumb of no more than 5 pounds per meal. And what that does is your horse's digestive system is moving at a constant rate. And so that 5 pounds a meal kind of gives you the opportunity to get the optimum digestibility of that in the small intestine and not be shoved to the hindgut. So if you have a horse that needs to have more volume, if they need more than 10 pounds a day, then I usually recommend implementing another meal. Because remember, we talked about those complete feeds that you could feed nothing but that as an example.
Mhm. Okay. I have another question of my own. There was a question in Zoom that I asked for just a little more clarification on. So Sophie, hopefully you saw that note. If you can just expand that question a little bit more, we'll be happy to ask it. I have a question about wheat middlings in a quote unquote grain-free diet, because I've seen a lot of people recommending particular grains as being grain-free, but it does contain wheat midds, which is part of a grain. So that's always confused me as to how you can call something grain-free or what is considered grain-free versus a grain.
I we don't make any grain-free diets. I'm with you. I consider part of a grain to include grain products.
Right.
And this is what I mentioned before when we talked about implementing human fads into the horse industry. Is it may or may not actually apply to the horse health, but it's something that people have interest in. So I don't necessarily have grain-free diets, not necessarily.
And I think that, also goes back to the first point you made, that a diet, like a grain diet, is designed to accompany what is lacking in forage. So if you happen to have forage that ticks all the boxes, that's great, and I guess you could go grain-free that way. So.
And I know of a number of operations that they have amazing forage. It checks the vast majority of the boxes, and they might just provide just a loose mineral, and that's it. And it covers their trace mineral needs. But once again, I think that depends on one, your horse, their workload, their lifestyle, And it also depends on, hey, are they still growing? Are they mature? Where are they at in their life stage? So I think the way that you choose to fill those gaps depends on what are your gaps.
Yeah, I think that's a great answer. Yeah, because I know that there's the grain-free debate, gets pretty heated. So I think that's a good way to answer it for sure. All right, so Sophie's expanded on her question. Some people have said that soy can have an effect on the behavior of mares. Do you know anything about that?
So the research, I haven't seen necessarily research on behavior of mares. The research I have seen has looked at mare reproductive cycles. So they were looking at soy estrogen versus, um, and how does that affect? And in that research, there was an effect of soy estrogen on mare cycles. And the reason because it is a plant sourced estrogen, so they didn't have that effect. So I haven't seen research on behavior changes in mares, but I could tell you that was the result of the research looking at mare reproductive cycles.
Always like research. That's always helpful. All right, I think we have worked through all the questions I've seen. Oh, just kidding. I knew if I said it, there'd be more coming in. All right. I am bored and we feed pellets. We need to add some sweet feed to keep the horses at their buckets since they're fed on the fence. I'm assuming that this messes with the mineral balance that you spoke of.
So yeah, so she was referencing whether she mixed textured feeds or pelleted feeds. Basically, I think if you put a few sprinkles, it's not going to alter your mineral recommendations. But if once again you did half and half and you cut your feed, half textured, half pelleted. So basically, I would probably recommend a way to help with keeping your horses at their feed buckets. I know horses are finicky and like to be difficult sometimes. But all that to say is, yeah, I don't recommend cutting your feeds and mixing them drastically.
Yeah, that's a common problem at my farm too, getting everybody to stay at their respective spot. Will this recording be published? That is a great question. I can answer that one. Yes. So we have been recording this whole time, and hopefully by the middle of next week, I will have the recording up on our YouTube channel. It will be available in the RRP Education Library. You will be able to watch the recording on our Facebook page as soon as we shut this off. And I believe all Technicalities, you guys are also going to share this as well. So it will be available in many, many places. Just keep an eye out next week. All right, last call for questions for Josie. If you are watching this, of course, after the fact and you have questions for Josie, her contact information is right here and you can reach out to her. But yeah, we'll give it 30 more seconds for anybody else watching live to add their questions. In the meantime, Josie, thank you so much for your time this evening. This has been super informative. I think everybody who's stuck around has gotten a lot out of it as well. So thanks very much.
No, thank you. I appreciate it. It's fun.
It is always fun. And it's fun for me too, because I'm a horse owner. So I get to sit here right in the front row and get all my own questions answered. All right, let's see. Okay, we have one last question on Facebook from Diane. So this is a little bit of a long one. Notwithstanding that every horse is different, when my off-track thoroughbred had serum allergy testing as a result of all over hives, he tested very high for sensitivity to oats, flax, cottonseed, and soy. He was receiving flaxseed at the time along with a ration balancer. I did an elimination diet. The hives returned in the fall. He then had skin testing at the vet school, which did not test foodstuffs, but in consultation with a dermatologist vet, she said a food allergy in horses is rare. Can you comment? It's kind of a long one. But.
No, that is true. When we're looking at food allergies, it is less. I mean, it is rare. I know there's a lot of panels out there looking at different levels of sensitivities, and I know a lot of folks that have concerns about soy, and that's a prime example of rarities to sensitivities. But what I typically see is exactly what she looked at, which was actual dermal sensitivities and outside. So maybe it was insects, or maybe it's something in the soil, or something that the horse is being exposed to in the shavings. And so I've seen a lot of outside dermal sensitivities, but I would say some of these food sensitivities, I think, are less common. I see a lot of them just because people are looking into it more. And it's not necessarily that there's an increase in horse sensitivities.
That's the part as we, learn more and dive into things more, then it seems like it creates more problems, but it's just learning more and sort of broadening your horizons. So and that's what happens, right? Like I've sat here now and I have more questions and more things to look into as a result of everything I learned tonight. So,
Yes.
all right, folks. Well, thanks very much for sticking with us this evening. And yes, this recording will be available after the fact. So once again, Josie, thanks very much for the time.
Thank you.
All right, everybody, have a good night.